Hello everyone and welcome to Edupedia World. Today we are going to continue with our Unit 1 of Chapter 2, that is Residential Status and Scope of Total Income. We have started this unit and now we are going to continue on it in this class of ours. So let us start this class. This unit had 3 learning objectives. We are done with the first 2 learning objectives and they are: Number 1, the relevance and significance of residential status in determining the total income of a person. And number 2, the types of residential status. And we were doing the last learning objective, and that are the rules for determining the residential status for different categories of person. So we'll continue with those rules. What are the different rules which determine that the assessee will fall under which category, which type of residential status, whether resident or resident and not ordinarily resident, or a non-resident. So today we'll continue with that and we'll go on to learn the conditions and rules to determine the category of resident and not ordinarily resident. And furthermore, we'll discuss about the residential status of companies, HUFs, etc. So let us start. Today we are going to discuss the topic of not ordinarily resident. In the previous session we had discussed the rules to be satisfied for an assessee to fall under the category of a resident. If he fulfill those rules and conditions, either of those conditions which we have done, then he is a resident. And if he is not able to fulfill any of the rules or conditions given, then he is a non-resident. Now today we'll discuss the residential status of not ordinarily resident. See, there are 3 types of residential status: resident and ordinarily resident and not ordinarily resident, and non-resident. So once we have classified an assessee as a resident, now we further need to classify whether that assessee is resident and ordinarily resident or resident and not ordinarily resident. So today we are going to discuss the conditions which will further classify a resident into ordinarily resident or not ordinarily resident. Further, one thing more which we need to know is that only individuals and Hindu undivided family can be resident but not ordinarily resident in India. All other classes of assessees can be either a resident or a non-resident. So, only an individual, a living being, or the HUF can be a resident and not ordinarily resident, or a resident and ordinarily resident. All other classes can be just a resident or a non-resident. So, for all other classes like companies, AOP, BOI, we just need to see whether they fulfill the conditions given in the criteria of being a resident. If they are fulfilled or not fulfilled, then accordingly they will be classified as resident or non-resident. But in case of individuals and HUF, we further need to classify whether they are ordinarily resident or not ordinarily resident. So let us see what are the conditions specified under section 6.6 for being not ordinarily resident. These are the 2 conditions which determine whether an assessee will fall under the category of not ordinarily resident. These 2 conditions come with the or condition, meaning either of the 2, either condition 1 or condition 2, any of the 2. If any of the 2 is followed by the assessee, or if the assessee falls under any of the given 2 conditions, then he will be assessed under the category of resident and not ordinarily resident. So, I being an assessee, if I am following under any of the given 2 conditions, then I will be categorized as resident and not ordinarily resident, and I'll be assessed accordingly. What are the 2 conditions, given 2 conditions? Number 1 is, if such individual has been non-resident in India in any 9 out of 10 previous years, preceding the relevant previous year. So what I have to see that this is the current previous year. I am being assessed for the current previous year. So I have to see that in the preceding 10 previous years, that is the year preceding this previous year. The 10 preceding previous year, in those 10 years, whether I am non-resident for 9 years or not. If I am a non-resident for 9 out of 10 preceding previous year, then I will be a not ordinarily resident. Number one condition. Or number second condition is, if such individual has during the 7 previous years preceding the relevant previous year been in India for a period of 729 days or less. If I am an individual and I have been in India in the 7 previous years preceding this year, the year for which I am being assessed, leaving that year, the 7 years preceding that year, in those 7 years, if my stay in India has been for a period of 729 days or less, then I will be a not ordinarily resident. So, the crux is that if I am an individual and if I am falling under any of the above two categories, whether the category condition 1 or condition 2, whether I have been assessed as a non-resident in 9 out of 10 previous year, or my stay in India during the 7 preceding previous years has been 729 days or less. Any of these two conditions, if I am falling under any of these two conditions, then I will be assessed as resident and not ordinarily resident. So, in a simpler way, in simpler terms, we can say that an individual is said to be a resident and ordinarily resident if and only if he satisfies both the following conditions. These two conditions are the reverse of the conditions we studied in the last slide. What are they? In the last slide, we studied that he is a non-resident in 9 out of 10 preceding years. So, this condition number 1 is the opposite of that. If he is a resident in any 2 out of the last 10 years preceding the relevant previous years, and his total stay in India in the last 7 years preceding the relevant previous year is 730 days or more. So what we have done is that we have reversed the two conditions given for the category of not ordinarily resident. So if we satisfy both these reverse conditions given for the not ordinarily resident condition, then we can be classified as resident and ordinarily resident. Not ordinarily resident is the opposite of ordinarily resident. So the conditions, these two conditions are also opposite of those two conditions given in the previous slide. In the previous slide, it was given that if any of those two conditions were satisfied by an SSE, then he would be regarded as a not ordinarily resident. And now in this slide, we are just reversing the situation and we are saying that if both these conditions are satisfied, then the SSE will fall under the category of resident and ordinarily resident. So you can just go either way. Either you can go that way of checking whether the SSE is falling under the not ordinarily resident category, or you can go the reversed way and check these two conditions. So if these two conditions are satisfied, meaning the resident is the citizen, the SSE in fact is the resident and ordinarily resident, and if any of these two conditions are not satisfied, then the SSE is not ordinarily resident. So you can check either way, either that way of checking whether he is a not ordinarily resident, or checking this way whether he is a ordinarily resident. Both the ways are similar. So we at last we can say, after studying all these things, is that if the individual satisfies both the conditions mentioned above, that is 2 out of last 10 years he is resident and in the last 7 years he is staying in India for 730 days or more. If both, just pay attention to this condition, both. Here the and condition is this. First and second, both these conditions are satisfied, then he will be classified as resident and ordinarily resident. And if only one condition is satisfied or none of the conditions are satisfied, then the individual will fall under the category of resident but not ordinarily resident. So, this is the thing about ordinarily resident and not ordinarily resident. We'll just discuss all these things in detail and with example to make the concepts more clear. So let us take one example to make this concept more strong in our minds. Now let us take this illustration for understanding the concept of residential status and understanding the various type of residential status in more detail and more clearly. In this illustration, we'll be able to understand more clearly what a resident is, what a non-resident is, what is resident and ordinarily resident, and what is resident but not ordinarily resident. Hope this illustration will make these concepts more clearer. What is it saying? Steve Waugh, the Australian cricketer, comes to India for 100 days every year. Find out his residential status for the assessment year 2015-16. So, in order to find the residential status, we'll first of all start with whether he is resident or non-resident. First of all, we'll find that. And after we find that, okay, if he is a resident, then further we'll find that if he is a resident and ordinarily resident or resident but not ordinarily resident. So, this way we will proceed. But if in step 1 only we get that he is a non-resident, then the question of ordinarily and not ordinarily does not arise and the question is completed over there only. So the first thing we do when we have to determine the residential status of any individual, first of all we determine whether he is a resident or non-resident. So let us start. So now let us see the solution. What is given there? For the purpose of his residential status in India for the assessment year 15-16, the relevant previous year is 14-15. So we have to see all the conditions given for resident, non-resident, ordinarily resident and not ordinarily resident with respect to the previous year 14-15. So what we have to do is number 1 is to decide and to see whether he is resident or non-resident. And what are the conditions given for deciding whether he is a resident or non-resident? We have done this in the previous class. So let us revise that. The conditions which needs to be satisfied to fall under the category of resident. What were they? The individual is said to be resident in India in any previous year if he satisfied any one of the following conditions. Here it was a or condition, either condition 1 or condition 2. If any of those conditions were satisfied, then the SSE will be called a resident. What were they? Number 1 was he has been in India during the previous year for a total period of 182 days or more. So when we apply this condition, it is not satisfied by the Australian cricketer because he was in India just for 100 days. It is given that he comes to India for 100 days every year. So it's evident that in the previous year also he was in India for 100 days. So he is not satisfying the first condition given for being a resident in India. Since this requires anyone, so we'll see the second condition. If he is not satisfying the first condition, no harm. We can always see the second conditions, and if he satisfies the second conditions, then he will be regarded as a resident. And what is the second condition? He has been in India during the 4 years immediately preceding the previous year for a total period of 365 days or more and has been in India for at least 60 days in the previous year. This was the second condition. So we'll apply this condition here in this question. So we see that the total stay of Steve Waugh in the last 4 years preceding the previous year is 400, that is 100 days every year into 4. So he is satisfying this condition of 365 days or more, and he has also been in India for 100 days in the previous year. So he is satisfying this 60 days conditions also. So since he is satisfying the full second condition, he will be regarded as a resident. So the first step is completed. We have determined that Steve Waugh is a resident. So now when we have determined that he is a resident, we have to see whether he is resident and ordinarily resident or resident but not ordinarily resident. For falling under the category of resident and ordinarily resident, he has to satisfy two conditions. And what are those conditions? He is a resident in any 2 out of the last 10 years preceding the previous year, and his total stay in India in the last 7 years preceding the relevant previous year is 730 days or more. So we have to see whether these two conditions are satisfied or not. Now we see that since his total stay in India in the last 7 years preceding the previous years is just 700 days, that is 100 days every year into 7 years, that is 700 days. So he is not satisfying the minimum requirement of 730 days in 7 years. So he is not satisfying one condition, and it is given that we have to satisfy both the conditions for being an ordinarily resident, and he is not satisfying any one condition. So since any one of the conditions is not being satisfied, the individual is resident but not ordinarily resident. Therefore, the residential status of Steve Waugh for the assessment year 15-16 is resident but not ordinarily resident. So you get it, how we calculate and how we determine the residential status. First of all, we determine whether the assessee is resident or a non-resident. If he is a non-resident, then the question ends there only. But if he falls under the category of a resident, then further we have to determine whether he is ordinarily resident or not ordinarily resident. Here in this case, Steve Waugh was determined as a resident, so we further determined whether he was ordinarily resident or not ordinarily resident. And since he did not satisfy one condition given in the conditions of ordinarily resident, he was determined to be a not ordinarily resident, because we have to satisfy both the conditions given for ordinarily resident. Until and unless we satisfy both the conditions, we will not fall under the category of ordinarily resident. And since Steve Waugh did not satisfy one condition, he was determined as not ordinarily resident. Let us take one more example for the better understanding of these concepts of residential status and the types of residential status. Illustration 2. What the question is saying is, Mr. B, a Canadian citizen, comes to India for the first time during the previous year 10-11. During the financial years 10-11, 11-12, 12-13, 13-14 and 14-15, he was in India for 55, 60, 90, 150 and 70 days respectively. Meaning in 10-11 he was in India for 55 days, 11-12 60 days, 12-13 90 days, 13-14 150 days and 14-15 70 days. So we have to determine his residential status for the assessment year 15-16. Now the solution. Since we have to determine his residential status for the assessment year 15-16, we have to see the previous year 14-15. All the conditions we have to see with regard to the previous year 14-15. So what we have to do first is, first of all, we have to determine whether he is a resident or a non-resident. And after we determine that, and if the assessee falls under the category of resident, we further see whether he is resident and ordinarily resident or resident but not ordinarily resident. But if the assessee is falling under the category of a non-resident in step 1 only, then further We don't have to do any calculations and the question completes there only, because a non-resident is not categorized into ordinarily and not ordinarily. So we'll proceed with step 1. What is that? We have to see whether the assessee is satisfying any of the two conditions given for being a resident of India. What are the two conditions? Number 1 was he has to be in India in the previous year for a period of 182 days or more. But here in this case, during the previous year 1415, he was in India for just 70 days. So this first condition is not being satisfied. So now we have to see the second condition. If the second condition is satisfied, then he will be a resident. But if the second condition is also not satisfied, then he will be regarded as a non-resident. And what was the second condition? The second condition was that he has been in India in the 4 years preceding the previous year for 365 days or more, and in the previous year for 60 days or more. So, during the previous year, he was in India for 70 days. So, the 60 days condition is being satisfied. And during the 4 years preceding the previous year, that is for year 11, 12, 12, 13, 13, 14, and 10, 11, 11, 12, 12, 13, and 13, 14, these 4 years. For these 4 years, the total stay should be 365 days. But we calculate it and we get that for these 4 years preceding the previous year 14, 15, the stay in India was for just 355 days. So the second condition is also not being fully satisfied. The 60 days condition is being satisfied, but the 365 days condition is not being satisfied. And since the second condition remains unfulfilled, he will be regarded as a non-resident for the previous year 1415. So the question ends here only. Since he is not a resident, the further uh, determination of ordinarily and not ordinarily does not come into question. So the conclusion in this question comes to that is, since he does not satisfy any of the conditions given under section 6(1) of being a resident of India, therefore he is a non-resident for the year 1450. Thank you, students. Hope you found this class worthy, and in the next class we'll do some more illustrations to make this concept of residential status very, very strong in your minds. So let's meet in the next class.